Web services. So web services are really just a way for us to expose functionality within our organization, within our applications, to the internet. So we can use them, third parties can use them, even the public can use them. And it's really neat. Just think of it really as exposing functions or methods, putting them on a web server so we can call them remotely. And really all you're doing is we can put our objects, the objects and classes that we build, we can put them on a web server, and then we can determine, what data can go into them and how users and individuals that tap into our web services can interact with them. And big companies started doing this, and web services got hot. Google, for instance, Google has a web service that we can tap into as the public. As a developer, I could go get a key from Google's website, download their SDK just to figure out how to use it, and then tap into it from our application and use it. So we can incorporate Google searches right into our application by using their web service. Same with big companies like eBay. eBay exposes all of their listings and such through a web service. Amazon exposes their entire catalog through a web service, so the public can tap into it. Public, people like us, developers, can incorporate this stuff into our applications. So web services are really cool, and they just allow us to expose certain parts of our organization and applications over the web through a web server so we can tap in and use it. So let's take a look here at what web services are all about. Jump into the outline. And the first thing you want to do is just talk a little bit about the technical side of web services, what really they're made up of. We'll talk a little bit about WSDL, WSDL as we call it, the Web Services Description Language, see what that's all about. And we'll talk about SOAP, which used to stand for the Simple Object Access Protocol, but that moniker kind of got dropped a little bit, and now it's just simply called SOAP, and it's just a protocol that web services use to communicate with. So we'll kind of take a look at those two underlying technologies, and then obviously hear what web services are all about, and then we'll jump into creating them and deploying them. It's very easy to create web services, get one up and running, and I'll show you just starting from scratch how to create an empty website project, add a web service into it, build throw a couple of functions in there, and then deploy it to a web server so we can then create a test and sample application to tap into our web service and pull the data right out of the web server and work with it in a different application. All right, let's take a quick introduction to web services. And again, just to kind of talk about the technical details of what they're all about. So we really just expose objects and functions over HTTP. That's what web services do. And what we'll do is we will build, we'll create a website. We'll add inside of the website, because a website really we're just going to have a container here, or web application. It's just going to be the container because, again, we're going to deploy this thing to IIS, to a web server. So if we have a web server over here, in the typical sense of a web application, we'll have .aspx files, right? Those are kind of our main working point. We have these web pages as ASPX files if we're building an ASP web application. In the web service world, we're going to build and work with ASMX files, which are really just, think of them as just code modules, really. There's code modules with methods in them that the web server is going to expose to the outside world. So what will happen is when we deploy this to a web server, our web service, other applications that are in development can basically discover this using WSDL, which we'll talk about in a second, discover this web service, which will allow them to work with the objects that are stored inside of it. And so they can work with those objects and the functions directly from their world. So whether they're over here in a web browser building their own web application, or they're down here on the Windows desktop building a Windows application, they can tap into our web service. So it's kind of neat that we're just exposing methods and functions. So anything that can tap in and use this this platform independent web service can use it. And that's the beauty of SOAP down here, is it's kind of a platform independent thing that, and that was the whole point of web services, is that it's XML based, so it's platform independent as well, and anything can use it. Anything can, you don't even have to be from a Windows environment. Linux people can tap into our web server to pull data out. And that's really one of the strong points of web services, is that you can use it from anywhere. All right, let's take a brief look here at an introduction to web services and just talk about some of the technical details. So web services, again, just allow us to expose our objects and functions over HTTP. So they work very similar to a web application. In fact, we're going to deploy our web services to a web server, because that's how they're going to be exposed to the internet. They're going to sit on a web server. We're basically going to build this web service just like we would build a web page, only instead of a user interface and content on it, It's just going to be this little code module with functions inside of it that outside applications can tap into. So what will happen is anybody that's developing an application outside of our network that wants to use our web service will have to discover it. And they do that through WSDL, the Web Service Description Language. This is what really just describes to the development platform that this user is building an application on. It describes to that programming language how the web service, I should say, needs to be interacted with. For instance, it'll describe how the objects are structured, what the data types of the objects that we're exposing are, and things of that nature, and also how to communicate with it. So WSDL just describes how the structure of the objects within our web service are. So it can then, kind of duplicate those objects on the client side, and now people can program against the objects that we created into our web service and through our web service. Now, the real big thing about web services and why they're so hot and why they're so neat and fun is because they're all XML based. WSDL, this Web Services Description Language, is just a bunch of XML to describe the objects and the communication points within our web services. SOAP, the Simple Object Access Protocol, it's XML based, and SOAP is just a protocol used to communicate between application and web service on the web server. And the reason that's neat, that everything's in XML, is because it's now platform independent. So you don't even need Windows machines to communicate with these. They could be on Linux, for that matter, because it's just XML, and everything can understand XML, whether on your Linux or whether on your Windows or any other platform out there. So that was kind of one of the big things with web services is they're platform independent. So the reason web services are easy to build and fun to build is because we don't have to worry about an interface. So there's a lot of work that we don't have to do there, because if we were building a web application, we'd have to worry about these .aspx files with front ends and code behinds and all that fun stuff, right? In a web service, we have a .asmx file that we're going to plan on the web server in a web application, and it doesn't have an interface. It's really just literally a code module with functions in it that we're going to expose for individuals building over the internet, whether they're building a web page or building, a desktop application. They can tap in to our web service and use that functionality right from their development environment. So again, in a nutshell, web services just allow us to expose the functionality from our applications over the internet. WSDL allows external clients and people and applications to discover our web service, and it also describes to these client development platforms how to interact with their web service and communicate with it. And the SOAP is just the communication medium, the protocol that is used over HTTP here, over these wires, to communicate between the client application and the web service. All right, so let's jump over to Nugget Lab here and take a look at how we can create, deploy, test, and consume web services. So let's minimize whiteboard, head over to Nugget Lab, and once we get over here, we're just going to hit the Start button and head up to Visual Web Developer 2010 Express once again. And when we're in here, we're going to create a new project. And actually what we want is a new website, technically. So let's hit New Website here, and we're just going to create an empty ASP.NET website, just like so. Let's just put this in the right spot here. We want this to go into 16-web services. All right, so we've got an empty website. There we are. And the next thing we want to do is add a web service into here. So let's just right-click, choose Add a New Item, and inside of here, if we scroll down a little bit, you'll see Web Service, just like so. And you can see it's got an .asmx file. And let's just name this web service, how about people.asmx. What we're going to do here is we created, way back in the beginning of this series, we created a people class, and we filled it up with people. So that's going to be kind of our data point. And we're going to take that, and we're going to allow people to do searches on our data through that class. So I'm going to hit Add, and this will get us our web service into our project here. And it gives us a nice, easy template to work with. Everything's really set up for us. It's got all the namespaces inside of it. And really the only thing we need to do is just add our web methods, and expose whatever functionality we need through these methods. And just to look at the structure here, here's our people.asmx file. This, like a web page, considered our front end. And then our code behind that is attached to the ASMX went into our app code folder called people.cs. And this is where we'll put all of our methods. And you can create private methods in here too. Just don't tag them with the web method, and they won't be available to the outside world. They'll just simply be available to our code module in here. So some things we need to do in here. Not really much. I'm just going to change the namespace here so it matches us. Let's just call this nuggetlab.com. That's where we'll be deploying it to keep it consistent with what's going to happen on our web server there. Services, and then we'll just do our people there. That looks pretty good. And the next thing I want to do is add those classes that we need to work with. And I added them into the C drive of this local machine here. So I'm just going to right-click on App Code, Add Existing Item, and let's just head up to the C drive. And here they are, Data and Person. I'm going to click Add. And just to refresh you on what these are here, our Person class just simply is a person class that is first name, last name, position, and home world. And you can see I already gave it the correct namespace. The video number on here is 16. And then our data is the same thing, only this just creates a list of those person classes and fills them up with data. And it's the exact same data we used way back when we used this in our object-oriented world when we talked about how to work with these classes and fill them up with data. So we're just going to reuse this code, reuse this data, and tap into it and basically expose it through the web service and allow people to do searches against it. So back into our main people.cs, where we're going to be writing most of our code. The only thing we need to do to access these classes and work with them is add a using here. Let's go nuggets.demos.98-361.16. There we are. So now we can start using those classes. And what we're going to do is we're just going to alter our hello world sample here, and we're going to return that list of people. So we'll do a list of people, and we're going to call this method here. This is how people are going to call it locally in their applications, do people search. And actually, no, we're going to actually return a list of person objects, not people objects. We want a list of all those person, because if we look back in our data class, we're actually returning that list of persons. So we're basically just going to slap a search engine on top of this get people routine that returns all these people, so we can search. And let's do it based on last name. So let's add an input parameter here called last name search, just like so. So the only thing we need to do now is write the code that filters out based on last name the people that this data class returns through that function. So what we can do here is return data.getPeople, right? And this, if we were just to do this, it would always return all of the people this function which would return, which is every one of them in here. But we're going to do something a little bit special, and I want to do something kind of neat here and expose you to something a little different. And this may be outside of the realm, but it's good to get uncomfortable every now and then in programming. That's how we keep moving forward, right? So what I'm going to do is use a little bit of link here, because again, we want to slap a filter onto this getPeople function, so it returns people based on the last name that programs are going to pass into this function. So I'm going to add a little link to this. I'm going to do a .where, and inside of here we're going to use a lambda expression. So this is LINQ, language integrated query, which is just a much easier way to do sorting, searching, filtering against objects within .NET, and you will definitely be exposed to it at some point in your programming career, because it's awesome. So we're just going to use what's called a lambda expression here to do a p.lastname.contains, and then just pass in our last name search, like so. And then we're just going to send this all to a list. All right, and now that's just one line of code to do all of that. And what I like to do is just kind of break this out at the dots so it looks it's a little bit easier to read here. So we'll do that and that. So each one of these is kind of a statement, so to speak. But really, all we're doing is slapping a link filter on top of our getPeople function, where, and then for each object, that's what this lambda expression is doing. It's saying for each object that this returns, do a comparison against last name and this parameter. And this will then, every time it has a match, pull it out and throw it into this list and throw it back through the web service. So that's it. We've got a web service built. It's ready to be used. The only thing we need to do now is deploy it, and then deploying it will obviously then make it available to people to discover it using WSDL within their applications, and then they'll be able to program against it. So let's do that. Let's first deploy it. So I'm going to do is just right click on our project here. Let's go to copy website. Let's just copy it right over. I'm going to connect to, check it out, remember our nuggetlab.com? I actually made a services application in there, so I'm going to just connect right to services, hit open, and once we're connected here, I'm just going to copy everything over like so. Alright, so we're copied over. Now what we can do is we should be able to browse to it. So let's just do this. Let's over to start. Let's open up Internet Information Services just for a second, just to make sure that we can browse to it. Expand everything, expand NuggetsLab.com, expand our services. And if we take a look at our content view here, we should be able to see people.asmx. If we right click and browse to it, we should get this. This is the standard ASMX test page. And in fact, if we do something neat here and do a $WSDL and hit enter, look at that. There's our XML. This is WSDL that describes everything in here. So it describes our function, our do people search, and the response. And it's also going to describe our actual person class. Check it out. There it is. So here's our person class. Here's just some requirements on it here. How many times it can minimum occur and max occur. And then each element within here and their data type. So that describes our person object. So we'll be able to work with this in a client application that consumes the web service. So that's all this WSDL does. It just describes, the functions that are in it, the data types that are in it, and then how it can communicate with it. Pretty cool, right? So, and just to hit back here, if we click on our function, you can actually, if you're on the server here, if you're on the actual server that the web service is on, if you're developed on the server, for instance, you can actually throw a search right against it and invoke it. For example, here, if we do a capital S, hit invoke, it's going to give us the 3 people with capital S in their last name. And I say capital because it's case sensitive. We didn't put any code in there to go against case sensitivity. So pretty cool, right? In fact, if we close out of this and do a lowercase s, we'll only get 1 because there's only one with a lowercase s in their name. Pretty cool. It's just returning XML. There's our person object serialized as XML because, again, that's how web services communicate. So really cool stuff, real easy to do. The only thing left to do is create a new application and show you how to really create a reference so we can work with those person objects in code and call this function in code. So let's do that. Let's close out of everything here. Let's go into our project, and I'm just going to add a project in here. So I'm going to go to File, Add, New Project, and let's add in here, how about a console application this time around? And where are you, console application? Oh, that's right. You know what we have to do? We have to head over to Visual C# 2010 Express. So I'm just going to hit Start, head up to Visual C# 2000 Express, get a new development environment open here. We're going to create a new project, and let's head over to the console application, and we'll do this thing, the same thing here. Let's call this 16 web service _ client, and hit OK. So if we want to work with that web service in code, we need to get those objects over here, not only so we can work with the web service itself and call the function do people search, but also work with those people objects so we can work with them directly and extract things like the home world, first name, last name, and all that good stuff. So what we can do is right click on our service, choose add a service reference, and here we can hit the discover button. You can see it's not going to find anything. This will actually just look inside of your project. So if you're on the full version of Visual Studio, and you can see what I was trying to do over here, is actually add another project into here. And discovering will actually look through your solution to find any projects that are web services, so you can kind of work in your development environment without even the need for a web server on your local machine. So that's really handy. But in our case, we deployed it already, and you can see just by dropping this down, it says services and solution. So what we need to do is we need to find and know the address to our web service. So I shouldn't have closed out of Internet Information Services. So let's go back into it here for a second. And I'm just going to go right back into NuggetsLab.com, our services here, into our content view. Just right click and view this in the browser. And I'm just going to copy this URL. All right, good, got it. I Control-C'd it. And now, let's just paste it right into this bar. Hit go, and there it is. Look at that, I found it. And we can expand it here and look at it. And there's our function in there, do people search. So now we just need to give it a name. And let's just call this, how about people web service? That sounds good. Something like that. We hit OK. And that is going to add for us into our project a people web service reference. And by the way, if you show all files and expand it, you can see these are really what this reference is just a bunch of things like the service map. And here's the WSDL. See that? Here's the actual WSDL that we looked at when we were on the web server there by doing a $WSDL. Same thing. And then just some other files here, some discovery information to tell it where it's at. And that's really about it. That's all that makes up the service here. So what we can do at this point is we can start writing code as if this were local. So we can call the function just like it were a local object. We can work with the person object. In fact, let's just add a using in here. So we can use the people web service. Oh, where are you, people web service? There it is, 16 underscore web client dot people web service. There we go. Had a prefix namespace on it there. So now we can work with this class and this object as if it were local. And let's just get some code in here into our console application to make this happen. So the first thing we're going to do is just a console.writeLine. We need some information from the user here. So let's tell them what we need. And let's just say search for a person through the web service. Something like that, right? Okay. So that sets us all up. That's just going to ask the individual, the user here that's using our client application, for some input, give them control. They're going to type in their search, whatever the last name is, hit enter, and that will store that information into our last name variable. So now comes the time to use the web service. Call our doPeopleSearch function, pass in this last name variable, and get some results. So let's do var WSPeople, that's what we're going to call this web service, equals a new people SOAP client. Right? And that's what's going to give us access to the actual web service itself. Now we need to create a person array, an actual people array that will allow us to store the results into it, so we can then loop through it and output it to the client based on however many people are returned through our last name variable there. So we're just going to simply do something like this: people web service dot person, and it's going to be an array, and we'll call this people equals WSPeople dot, and there it is, doPeopleSearch. And we're going to pass in our last name variable, and that's going to go through the web service, pass in whatever the user typed into our console window here, hit the web server, and then return all the people that match that last name. So the only thing left for us to do is output this to the user. So let's just get some basic output code here into the window. So we'll just do a writeLine. Let's just do a writeLine first, just to give us a line break. And then we'll say results, something like that. And now we just need a loop. Let's close that off there. Now we just need a loop. So let's do a for each, like so. And what we need to for each through is that list above. And what this is going to be is a bunch of person objects. So let's do person, and we'll just call this person. How about P? There we go. In our people variable above. So for each one inside of our people variable up here, our people array that we created, we want to do something with it. And let's just write to the console, console.writeLine. Let's just do how about a 0 and a 1 using the format functions here. The first one is going to be p.firstname, and the second one p.lastname. But isn't this cool that we can actually use this person object that we created that's going to be sitting on our web server? People outside of our world that tap into our web service can use our objects that we created. It's pretty cool because we're using this actual person object. When we do a p dot, we get everything that's inside here: position, homeworld, last name, first name, all the properties that we defined in this class when we built it. So really neat stuff. And finally here, the last thing we need to do is just a console.read so it stays open for us when we run it. So let's run this. Let's just make sure that this works here. And as soon as we run this application, it's going to ask us for that. As soon as we type it in, it's going to go through the web service and hopefully pull back the right data here. So I'm going to type in a capital S, hit enter. And what do we get? Hey, look at that. We get it all. Here's the result: Skywalker Solo and myself, Schulte. And we all are returned through that search there. So pretty cool. That actually went, again, through the web service, did the doPeopleSearch on the web service, pulled back the right data, all the way through the web service, back into our client application, and outputted it to the window. So that's all there is to web services. Really, it's just a matter of, in your actual web service itself, building your .asmx file, which really just has a code behind that you're going to create these functions in, tag them with webMethod if you want them to be exposed. And then, a lot of times you'll either be hitting a database or doing some other functionality. I mean, we could have created a very simple function here that just said add, that accepted two numbers. We could pass in two numbers and it'll return us the results as an integer. But I like to show this kind of stuff that'll more real world stuff, because you'll be returning objects and things like that in the real world. So that's all there is to it. Just building an ASMX file here, building a web service, deploying it to a web service, and then it's just a matter of discovering it from client applications so they can use it. And you may be the one developing the client application outside your network, but whatever the case is, this is what allows us to do it. It's just a matter of discovering it by creating a reference, which will use WSDL to discover it, and then everything else is, just kind of happens automatically. SOAP happens under the hood. There's nothing really you have to do with SOAP. It's just theory at that point. Just kind of happens, and really it's just a matter of designing your web services and knowing how to use them from your client applications. All right, so in this CBT Nugget, we took a look at web services. We started off with a look at an introduction to web services, just saw what they are, that they allow us to expose functionality through a web server, just like calling functions over the web, just like we do locally within our applications. And then we saw that kind of on the technical side, that it's really just a bunch of XML. That's all the web service is. It describes how clients that tap into our web service can communicate with the web service, and it describes the objects that the web service uses so they can use them in the client application. And we saw that SOAP is just a protocol that is used to communicate between client applications and web services. And then we took a good look at how to create a web service, deploy a web service, consume and test a web service. I hope this has been informative for you, and I thank you for viewing.